Welcome to the Elephant in the Room, where today we're going to discuss one of my, favorite topics and pet peeves at the same time. So we're going to chat about failure today. And I think, look, we live in a world today where I think failure has been socialized pretty heavily over the last few years. You hear things like fail early, fail fast, fail often, fail forward. Like failure is just an accepted part of business culture. And, I think there's a positive element to that because you give your people permission space to take risks and not always have to hit a home run, right? But there's a downside to that too. Are they taking the right risks for the right reasons at the right time? So I think today we'll kind of banter around failure a little bit and see if we can reach any points of agreement. So, Jaco, thoughts on failure?
Yeah, Mike, if there's any psychologists listening in today, I would say health warning for our discussion today. I would say we should put failure in context, so not necessarily the psychological context, but in a business context. Don't make it a clinical disorder or an organizational crime, but it's something that should not be treated but treasured. So that would be my opening statement for today.
Yeah. I think it's a great comment. I mean, a lot of it depends on how you define failure, right? So there's about 50 different acronyms for failure: the false expectation, assumed real, all those types of things. But I think in my mind, failure to me signals finality, right? It's like you're done, you've failed, there's no go forward. I don't think failure is pivoting or evolving or changing positions. As long as you're moving, in my mind, you haven't failed. It's when you throw in the towel and there's an element of finality that's what I view as failure. I don't know, Rue, Shaina, thoughts?
I don't know. I think that failure is one of those topics that, especially my generation, is a bit uncomfortable to talk about, but I think you need to embrace early. And it's funny. I think I am in the United States because I saw my parents fail through a multi-million-dollar business that went under, and it led to us having to move to a whole different country and start. But I think that created a different dynamic in the way that I think, which I can only appreciate. It's like seeing them get up, start a business here, making it here, even without knowing the language, changed my perspective. And now that I hear you say it, and the way that you put it, Mike, couldn't be more true. It's about keep moving, keep going, because many individuals could have easily just been like, oh, that's it. This is it. We're done. But it's more like, cool, how do we start over? What is the next step? What do we do next? How do we continue to improve? And if we can have that kind of mentality, especially in the business world, I think failure is just part of day-to-day life, and that's how you grow. I don't think you grow from positive experiences.
Yeah. I mean, I think about the classic story of Abraham Lincoln, right? Who had so many failures throughout his life, and all of a sudden he ends up as president of the United States. But he went through a whole litany of failures that were just, you look at it, and any one of them would have stopped most mere mortals. Yet he just kept going, right? And I think you look at anybody that has achieved any level of significance or success, and it's not necessarily the success that has defined them as much as the journey and how they got to that place, how they got to that time and space. And so, some call it failures, some call it transitions, some call them development opportunities, some call them hurdles or roadblocks, but whatever you label it, it's kind of, where your mindset is, right? So if you label something as a failure and you hang your head and you feel like you've let yourself down or others down, that creates a whole psychological dynamic, as opposed to, well, that didn't work so well. Maybe I need to go left instead of right, or zig instead of zag. And so it's really kind of a mental construct. But the challenge is, how do you kind of inculcate the right construct in a broader team, right?
Yeah.
To me, I think that speaks to the leadership of the group and the ability for the group to feel like they have the room to make mistakes. You know, because I think there's a difference between like making a mistake or testing a hypothesis and failing.
Bingo.
You know, and when we don't teach that difference and we just talk about being unsuccessful as failing, then people are now risk averse and they're afraid to make mistakes, which is not the environment that you want to operate at.
Yeah. No, I think that's 100% spot on, because, you know, I was joking before we jumped online here that I've got a PhD in failure, you know, and I think I've made a tremendous amount of mistakes, and some of them of magnitudes of huge significance, right? But, you know, I'm one of those guys, you knock me down, I pop back up. I'm like a bad penny, you know, I just keep kind of coming back. And I think it's just a mindset. And some people have that innately. Some people learn it. Some people never learn it. And so I think a lot of it is the experience you've had growing up, the experience you've had early on in your career, the people that have mentored you or coached you or breathed into your life, you know, what labels have they put on those experiences? And so for me, unless it's, I don't know, extinction level, unless it's fatal, it's not really failure. Now, all of that said, I want to be really careful organizationally so that we're very accepting and forgiving of reasonable, rational mistakes, right? Testing a thesis, trying out, you know, stretching, you know, those types of things. That's just part of a healthy culture. And so when people make those types of mistakes for the right reasons, you know, they're learning opportunities, right? They're not failures. But what we don't want to do is communicate a message that, hey, take uncalculated risks for, you know, bad reasons, and gee, here's a trophy, right? I mean, I think that's what we have to be careful of. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I like what you say, Mike. You know, I think it's not a swear word to fail, but it's maybe more something that helps you to unlock potential, sometimes even hidden potential. I always say, you know, I would make failure part of your success strategy. I think I've mentioned this in one of our previous live streams that Microsoft, in the time when Bill Gates still managed the company, he used to hire people who failed, you know, who had the bumpy road and who knows how it looks like, those who had war stories. Because if you know what failure looks like, you probably also know what success looks like. So I would say, you know, no failure is if somebody has no failures, they're probably not pushing the boundaries enough.
100%.
They're probably not creative enough. Maybe they have a low learning curve. So I like the fact that companies set themselves up so they create a safe environment, so that it's okay to fail and to learn from those failures.
Yeah. You know, I think any time a word or a phrase becomes part of the lexicon, you have to be really careful about the definitions. And I think that's what we're sorting through here, because I look at what we do here and what we encourage our clients to do, right? We're always talking about reframe, reimagine, reinvent. And it's always in an effort to move forward. It's in an effort to stretch. And not all of those exercises end well, right? I've seen far too many of the movies that don't end well. But if they're advancing the ball and the risks are acceptable, that's how you grow. That's how you create a healthy environment. And so, you know, in our world, we regrettably walk into client situations where there's a culture of fear, right? Where people don't trust one another and they won't allow failure because of the ripple effects or how it manifests itself in the ecosystem. And so for me, those are really tough environments to work in. And I think we're seeing more and more acceptance. Corporations are getting less and less formal, less and less hierarchical, less and less structured. They're more loose collaborative networks, which kind of have to exist on a basis of trust, which has to put some definitions in place around failure. So there are a lot of good trends out there right now, but I think it's the polar ends of the spectrum that I worry about. People that just write off any failure as acceptable, because I don't believe in that, or people that believe that no failure is acceptable. That it's both ends of the spectrum that I think are dangerous. Thoughts?
Part of me wonders, like, how much is it a psychological thing where someone is not willing to fail for their own kind of like security, and it's not even about like the choice they're trying to make or the environment they're working in, but they just don't want to be viewed as someone who has failed. Like, how do you talk to that person and encourage them basically to stretch or to try something new?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we live in a different world today, right? Because I remember when I was starting out in business, there were, I don't know, people that would hide in plain view, right? If the organization was large enough, they could kind of show up to the meetings. They could, show up in the morning and leave at the right time. They could just kind of exist, right? And they could hide in plain view for years. If they didn't make any waves, if they didn't say the wrong thing, if they just kind of phoned it in, they were safe. Those environments don't exist in plenty today. I mean, they still exist, but today you're only in this organization, in most healthy organizations, your survival or your longevity or your future basically depends on your ability to contribute, right? To be visible, to be heard, to be seen, not just in a political way, right? But in an outcomes oriented way. You can't just hide out anymore. So I think if you're part of an organization and you're not known and your work isn't contributing, I would say, that person is running very close to the edge. They're on very thin ice in a healthy organization.
Yeah, I think if one, and if you really want to understand failure, one have to realize that it's something that's very contextual. There is, it's related to individual personalities. It's related exactly what you said, Mike. I'm happy that you brought it up to past experiences. The way that you've been, your home upbringing, the role models you had. It's the context that moment of failure happens in. It plays into natural talent. So there's a lot of factors that influence it, and because of that, people kind of develop all kinds of mechanisms to deal with that. And for us, I think in our line of job, it's also to understand a little bit the fear for failure. What's behind it? What are the levers? It's associated with something negative, and that's why people avoid certain activities. Sometimes it has it goes so far as having physical or psychological effects. It's not for nothing that people get stressed out, or they get depression. So it's finding a modus to work through that fear of failure, to coach people to get to a moment where they can really unleash their the power and the internal motivation they have to be successful.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Jose just asked a question: what's the weight of culture based on somebody's country of origin, their education, their family? How does that play into mindset? And my answer would be, initially, it's everything. Initially, that's your baseline, right? That's kind of that's your hardwiring. Now, where you take it, to Rue's point, and citing his family circumstances, they worked on that. They probably overcame some cultural issues, and went through a lot of change and a lot of learning and a lot of development. But initially, I think Jose is very astute in pointing out, the culture with regard to failure in Japan is different than it is in Iceland, is different than it is in Havana, right? It depends on where you're from. So initially, I think it's everything. What you do from that baseline forward, I think that's very individualistic. Thoughts?
I think, for me, it was my family was the place where I had the highest expectations, put on me, I guess, but then also like the most support. So it like kind of counterbalanced, where like my parents were expecting a lot out of me, but then they weren't going to let me just like fall flat on my face. And I knew that. So like I had the confidence to try new things and to like push myself. So I guess, just like recognizing, and maybe this is something that I didn't really appreciate until I got into college and like away from my family, but the people in your life as a child really have a huge influence on like your relationship to failure and your relationship to yourself in that way.
Yeah, we had this discussion the other day amongst friends, and you really see this happening next to the hockey field or the football field. You see parents stressing out and being very, very active and verbally active and even sometimes abusive. But it very much reflects something of their own inner self, their own fear to fail, and they kind of project that onto their kids. And luckily, some of these kids also, they get really good coaching, and they also give some pushback. But so I kind of agree with you that where you come from and the role models you have and how you learn to deal with failure says a lot about the way that you act upon it in real life, in the here.
Jaco and Shaina, I was a product of that environment, right? I was very involved in athletics growing up, and my parents had a standard for me that I could never achieve, right? During baseball season, I could go 3 for 4 with 2 home runs and a double. I could make great plays in the field. Never enough, because I'd come home and I'd get ripped to pieces over the called strike that I took on the inside corner. It wouldn't matter what I did. It was never enough. And that set my entire life in motion, right? Because the balance of my life was always striving to attain something that I just couldn't ever get to that level. And it was only when my dad passed away that I really came to grips with that, right? I had to kind of wrestle that animal to the ground. And so if you guys wonder why I'm always pushing and I'm always looking for the next version of something and a better version of it, that's how my neural pathways were etched for decades, right? And so, I'm trying to reprogram that and soften that a little bit. But, there was also some good in with the craziness, because if it wasn't for that, I probably would not have attained a lot of the things that I did, because I was just intrinsically motivated, because I knew I had to always be better. And so it was part crazy, part curse, part blessing, but, it is what it is.
So the interesting thing is that, if you look at literature, there's because of sports being monetized so much these days, think about tennis, football, there's huge amounts of money. There's a lot of studies. It's actually a very important theme, trying to understand the drivers and the motivators, of failure in relation to success. Because if you understand that, if you can tweak it, you can make people more successful. Now, Louise makes an interesting comment. She says you cannot always succeed, but does this constitute failure? It's a great comment, because I think, no, it doesn't constitute failure. If I may get personal, Louise, from my own point of view, I'll use myself as an example, being a golf player. For me, you really have to get to a point where you accept your own limitations. It makes a huge difference in how you go about with failure, and set realistic goals. I mean, if I would set a goal, my goals as if I am Tiger Woods, I'm going to fail every time. I'm going to get into that vicious spiral. I'm going to have all kinds of coping mechanisms, avoiding playing with certain people, going to a coach, getting some emotionally focused training, but it won't really alleviate my fear for failure.
Yeah. Yeah, so Dimitri asked a great question. Go ahead, Rick.
No, I was going to ask, because as I'm listening to this conversation, I've been quiet because I'm listening. And from a leader perspective, like if you put yourself in a leader seat, especially in this day and age where you have to shift gears often at any given organization, and you're always switching your approach to the point that any given role can be different from year to year. How do you create an environment where your team feels comfortable taking on new risks and not necessarily viewing it as an opportunity to fail, but rather an opportunity to try something new, even though one of the outcomes can be succeeding or failing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, it gets back to the whole vision, mission, strategy kind of a conversation, because if you're aligned around values, if there's clarity around the vision, if the mission is well laid out and the strategy supports that, you operationalize it, then I think people become less change adverse, right? They understand that we're going to stretch, that we're going to try new things. And organizationally, like in this organization, I think all of us have experienced one another maybe not achieving something that they set out to achieve, right? And what do? We don't hit them over the head with a stick. We come alongside them and help them move the ball forward. And so I think it really is about aligning those expectations and then communicating very candidly. And look, I talk about my failures. I don't often talk about success. I almost always talk about failure because I think there's more to learn in those mistakes than there are in the outcomes, because the outcomes only exist because of the mistakes that were born in the creation of those outcomes. And so I think it really, you have to talk about this stuff. I was looking at Dimitri's question earlier, and it said one of the best things about failure is it's a necessary ingredient to acquire humility, right? And so when you see somebody that is ego-driven, narcissistic, all about themselves, all about their accomplishments, everybody in the room knows that you're getting some version of the truth, but it's not the whole truth, certainly. And when there's a lack of humility there, it probably just means that they haven't experienced some of the things that they need to experience in order to acquire that humility. And that does often come from trials and tribulations. So I couldn't agree more with Dimitri's comment. What do you guys think?
Yeah, Ro, if I may throw in a dime here, I know that there's been lots of talks in other live streams about if you look at leaders and their setup, having a growth mindset, or as we commonly say, open mindset, or having a kind of a fixed mindset or a closed mindset, and in my view, let me put it this way: I like a leadership style where you can see this growth mindset being lived out in the boardroom. It's boards where they're inclined to create an environment where it's okay to take a bit more risks, calculated, obviously, to try new things, where it's okay to fail, but to learn, where people can express different views, where failure is actually an opportunity to grow. I like that. I like that mindsets in leaders. And what I like less, but it doesn't mean that they're not successful. You also really get people in leadership positions who has a kind of a closed mindset. They're very focused, and it's fixed, and I'm good at this and I'm bad at this, and I focus on what I'm good at, and they're still successful. But I think in general, for the good of the broader community, for the good of the company, that growth open mindset, it creates an environment for people to grow and to be themselves and to excel.
Yeah. I mean, we had an interesting session yesterday. We rolled out a whole portfolio of strategic initiatives yesterday here in the U.S. And so we had, the preparation leading up to that was huge, right? We had different people working on different outlines and different parts of it. And yesterday's meeting was preceded by circulating a couple of fairly exhaustive documents, as well as a video by Dan, our CEO. And so, that all led up to the launch of this. And then we had all the leaders online talking about timelines and roles and platforms and tools. And it was very clear to me that some of the expectations that were set were hugely aggressive, right? Dan is nothing if not aggressive. But, and there were people very right from the get-go talking about, hey, I don't know if we can do this, right? And so we're stretching, we're testing, but we're moving and we're talking about it, and we're communicating across mediums and modalities, and we're teaming around this, and nobody has to accomplish this thing all on their own, right? There are multiple teams, all supported, all coordinated. And, I promise you a couple of things. I promise you we'll make progress. I promise there'll be some good outcomes. And I promise some of the theses that are outlined will probably not stand up. And, there'll be some elasticity in this thing. But that's how you move, right? And so I guess, Rue, that's, I guess a comment is, we're kind of living how we define failures and mistakes and stretch hurdles and things like that real time in our organization. And my guess is most companies are doing the exact same thing right now, because we're dealing with COVID, we're dealing with economic tumult, we're dealing with political discord. I mean, there's so many changes impacting every organization out there that they're all having to rethink these things right now. So, this is a time where you're going to see what your leadership does with failure and mistakes, whether they embrace them, whether they reject them, how they define them, how they support them. But this is the time to kind of watch and learn and be part of it, right? Because you're going to see it real time in virtually every organization that's still, switching on the lights in the morning.
Yeah, we had this discussion in the MENA team too, in one of the bi-weeklies about the COVID-19 and how to proceed. And I guess one of the things we discussed was even in a commercial environment, a failure is if you reframe it's just about the angle you look at what's happening. It's one attempt closer to be successful, or it's another great opportunity to improve. So it's we sometimes so much bogged down by self-limiting beliefs. I cannot do this, or that's not for me. And the trick, I would say, is to try to find the right lever to remove these self-limiting beliefs, to get into a spin of, Mike, if I may use your words, I think it's something you would say is fail better, or fail up, or fail forward. That would be the Mike Myatt speech. But this is, I really believe in the power of reframing situations, and because that makes it easier to deal with, but it also creates the positive spin you sometimes need to just get yourself up and running again, and put the energy at the right place.
Yeah. Well, I think there's some realities that people just have to wrap their mind around. It's like, what stresses somebody out? I mean, I know people that think the world is falling apart if they get a hangnail, And I've watched other people that can put the world on their shoulders and move out and not even exhibit stress, right? So everybody has different tolerances. But if you just look at the reality of what failure is, so, you know, to you, Jaco, you talked about golf, right? You know, what's the reality of what you're going to shoot in a round, right? I mean, if you're trying to shoot scratch golf and you're, you know, a 12 handicap, not going to happen. You know, you can't even get that lucky to make it happen, right? If you're a baseball player, I mean, you know, historically, you fail 7 out of 10 times, you're probably an all-star, right? If you hit 300, you've got a great career, you know, and that's failing 7 out of 10 times. So, I mean, you just have to look at the reality of life is just a long journey of opportunities to make mistakes. And you either learn from them or you repeat them. You know, they either develop you and shape you and move you forward, or they put you 6 feet under. And you know, you can talk about external causation. You can talk about, you know, Jaco, you were talking about negative self-talk. I mean, all of those. I mean, you can look at all kinds of corollaries, but at the end of the day, it's here and it's here, right? It's what's in your head, what's in your heart.
It's about building up, I think, a bit of a mental stamina. There was a golfer, Gary Player. He used to say, "The more I practice, the luckier I get." And I really love that saying. Maybe some other people said it too, but it's also about, you know, putting your head down to it and accept that failure is part of the game plan. And what did I learn from it, and how am I going to do this better?
Yeah. I mean, you know, it is that practice. And I think, you know, we just had a couple of comments about taking risks, right? And I think, at least in this organization, I would rather every one of our teammates take risks every day to stretch themselves and stretch us. Now, you know, I'd prefer that somebody not make an extinction level, you know, decision around risk, you know, that craters everything we've created. But that's not going to happen because we have things in place to keep that from happening. But on a day in, day out basis, I want everybody to stretch themselves, right? I mean, you know, there's a lot of talk around best practices and methodologies, and, you know, those things have their place, but they also kind of predefine how much risk you're willing to take, or predefine your definition of success. And while there have to be some boundaries and guidelines and processes and rules, I mean, that's well and good. But if you don't allow people the opportunity to take a risk, you know, that's the biggest self-limiting thing that you can, I guess, install in a corporation that will just keep you from growing. You know, thoughts on that?
The thoughts bouncing around in my head right now when we talk about risk is like, can you teach somebody how to take a calculated risk? Or is that like a thought process that they have to come to you with? And it's your job then to communicate like what is acceptable risk and what is catastrophic risk. Because I think depending on the context, it can be different. And so I'm just trying to like distill how to make calculated risk, but I'm struggling right now.
So, you know, I've always said courage isn't a skill, it's a decision, right? And I think, you know, what we're talking about is just decision framing here, and understanding the construct of making good decisions. And I think, yes, you can teach risk management because corporations are full of risk managers, you know, people that institutionalized not taking risk to their own detriment, right? They've killed their business because they've over-rotated to managing risk and under-rotated to managing opportunity, right? So it's that risk-reward balance. And so can you teach that? Absolutely. And I think probably the biggest thing that most leadership teams have to do right now is take people's, natural bent towards not making a big mistake and kind of freeing them up to take a couple of whacks at things. Because, when I look at somebody's resume and I see all the accolades and, the great trajectory and we work a lot with board and C-level executives, right? That's 90+% of what we do. And all their resumes look marvelous. They all have gravitas and pedigree and great track records. And, they all show the right things. I shred that thing, throw it away. I want to know, what mistakes you made. Tell me about the failures. Tell me about the challenges. Tell me about when everything didn't work and what you did next. That's how you test a leader's mettle, is what they do when everything goes wrong. It's the moment after everything goes wrong that you learn what somebody's made of. Anybody can sit around and just steer the ship when everything's going well, put them in the middle of a violent storm, see what they do.
That's when the real leaders comes to the front. I would like to comment on Jose Miguel, his question. He asked, is there a positive correlation between self-awareness and being clear about taking more or less risks? So that's a very interesting question. And I won't pretend that I know the answer. And I think this is the subject of many studies, but I'll give 2 examples I can think of where I think that if these people had a bit more self-awareness, things could have gone very different. I'm thinking of Kay Whitmore. I guess Mike, you probably know or knew. There's this famous example of him. He was the CEO of Eastman Kodak, and he fell asleep during a meeting with Bill Gates, where they were talking about his company's products being integrated with Windows. Imagine that. So, I would say, yes, if he had just a little bit more self-awareness, and it could have turned out very differently. There's another example of Carly Fiorina. I can still remember the time I worked at Gemini, and she was known as somebody that really very easily antagonated her workers and also investors, for that matter, never doubting her own righteousness in situations, and she almost managed to wipe all the value of HP, and she tried to buy PwC those days, the consulting part, for $14 billion, and at the end it went to IBM for $4 billion. Positively, I would say definitely a correlation between some form of self-awareness as a leader and what you do in that, how you act in that position as being a leader, and taking more or less risks. I think you would take less risks and possibly sometimes a bit more if you have a better understanding of your own personal dynamics. And that's why I think great leaders also have great coaches.
Coaches?
Yeah.
Or coaches?
Say again, Shaina?
Coaches or
coaches. Yeah. I think it's, I come from a background where it was almost, it wasn't that acceptable having a coach. Why would you have a coach? What's wrong with you? But these days, I think a responsible leader are also inclined to have a really good coach, somebody that can reflect and just hold up the mirror.
That's what I was thinking of as you were talking, was like, if you're self-aware, you know where your gaps are, and that's where you find the teammates or coaches to fill those gaps, or at least point those out in those situations.
Yeah, they're called blind spots for a reason. You can't see them. You need other people there for that. And I think, that's an interesting segue, because in my mind, it's really easy to take this discussion and make it very transactional, make it very strategic, make it very not personal. And I think, when you talk about engaging other people, if the engagement is, what's in it for me, or what do I get out of this, or how do I advance this agenda or that agenda, versus just really zeroing in on the relationship, right? I mean, a lot of my best business decisions and a lot of my best counsel to clients has been based on personal elements, relational elements that inform and shape the more transactional elements. So, if you're talking about, the CEOs that we can all point to that failed miserably, by and large, they were isolated, insular. They were very sequestered. They were kind of in their own thought bubble. I mean, by design, they created an environment that was doomed for failure, and everybody around them saw it. Many people around them signaled. It's like, the flares are going off everywhere because it's obvious that somebody's speeding toward that brick wall. But if they're not open to receiving help, receiving guidance and counsel, likely they're going to hit that wall. And when it's the CEO, the consequences are devastating. So I think, Jaco, you bring up a great point. I mean, most of my book of business is CEO coaching and board advisory work. And all I do is help people identify gaps and blind spots and challenges and opportunities, and how to balance the risk, and how to have a good worldview, and how to kind of let the facades down and be human, not just be the suit in the corner office, but be a real human being. And those are the organizations where people will take risks, and they will define failures appropriately. They'll put them in context, and those organizations thrive. And when those elements don't exist, it's just trouble in River City. So.
Yeah, what fascinates me is, Mike, is I would call it the fear factor, that you get very powerful BOD members, people in leadership positions, who just by default are have strong opinions. They know how the world works and how it should work according to themselves, and then the disability of their surroundings for some form of corrective behavior. How do you deal with that? So when you're in a situation where there's a very strong CEO, either being surrounded by a board that say yes and amen to everything he or she proposes, but there's still that, basically because of the fear factor of being dismissed or ridiculed.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. There's the old saying, most CEOs have the board they want, not the board they need, right? And I think historically what's happened is most boards have been more about comforting the CEO rather than, putting in place proper governance and making the CEO uncomfortable and stretching the CEO, right? That's changed in recent times. The last decade, board composition has shifted measurably, and for the right reasons. I think, but there's still a lot of boardrooms today where I'll walk in and, the board members are essentially close friends of the chief executive officer. They're not going to rebut or rebuke anything, because they don't want to lose their board seat, right? They don't want to lose access to the G5 or the PGA event, or the equity and the perks that come along with being on a big public board. And those boards are transforming rapidly because CEOs have to deal with something today that in previous times was much more manageable, right? I think activist shareholders are much more prevalent today. media is much more invasive today. Whistleblowers, I mean, you name it, you know, whether it's media, public policy, you know, vicious analysts on a conference call, right? I mean, it can be any number of things that are forcing CEOs to surround themselves with the board they need, not just the board they want. So we're seeing good movement in that area.
Yeah, I think one of the big changes is the refocus away from. It doesn't happen everywhere, I have to say. We just saw what happened to one of the big companies being jointly owned in the Netherlands and in the UK, where actually there was I think the drive for shareholder value was much bigger than the drive for stakeholder value. And that's where you see, you know, you get CEOs that starting to make decisions that pivots towards shareholders instead of stakeholders, which is maybe a discussion for a different time. And I think it's very interesting to look at the difference between one-tier boards and two-tier boards. You just see that in a two-tier board, the board often are more critical because they are more at arm's length and you know, less involved in the day-to-day politics. So that helps to kind of infuse some corrective behavior in the management board if you have that two-tier board system.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting though. Pendulums swing, right? And you know, we got way too laissez-faire. Now we're, you know, probably over-rotated to governance. Now we're kind of, you know, drifting more towards social justice, social impact, purpose-driven, you know, that, you know, but there's a balance point there that we need to find. And I think it's just the nature of business cycles. As that pendulum swings, you know, boards react, the C-suite reacts, you know, it shapes the strategy, it shapes everything. It's just kind of this big trickle down type of a thing. But I think what's interesting today, at least, I think culture used to be all about tone from the top, 100%, right? Now it's that, but it's also bottom up and it's also middle out. You know, it's becoming almost impossible to be that individual CEO that reigns with a iron grip, right? I mean, I think those days are just over. Now, where we're going to go, my crystal ball isn't any better than anybody else's, but we're definitely on a journey, and there's a lot of changes going on as we speak, and I think most good.
Yeah, you actually almost anticipated my question, but I assume that there's not going to be an answer to that. So the question was really, as it sways and pivots, you know, what's going to be next? Because now, obviously, you're right. There's a big focus on environment, social justice, stakeholder, the whole stakeholder environment. But it will change again. The question is just to what? Which I don't have the answer either.
Yeah, I think, you know, many, this isn't my phrase by any stretch of the imagination, but, you know, it's capitalism, you know, 2.0 or 3.0 or 4.0, right? I mean, I think there's many benefits of capitalism as it's been adjudicated in the market, for lack of better definition. There's also been some bodies in the wake, right? And so how do we take the positives of that and make it more acceptable on a broader societal basis without losing the things that make capitalism what it is, right? I don't think we throw it out the window and replace it with social experiments that historically have proven not to work. I think we evolve it to be a better version of itself. And what that looks like, you know, we're on that journey. We'll see.
It's a difficult one. I think if you speak to 16-year-olds, they will tell you and possibly also in the US and other places, that capitalism failed. I mean, if you look around, you don't only need to turn on the TV. It looks like, at least, that it failed, and I think that the younger generation is going to make huge changes to the way that companies are being run, or we used companies to be run. So I'm a bit more skeptical. I think if you would ask me about the more from a socialistic perspective or a capitalistic, that it also, the pendulum is also swinging away from capitalism, because of the fact that it brings a lot of benefit to a smaller amount of people, and we have social media which just blow up the huge differences. So it's interesting how it's going to evolve in the future.
I don't know. That one made me laugh. So I think it's a little different. I think the perception of it is shifting, and I think social media has been the reason why. Because I think social media is a very small percentage of people that are vocal there, but it seems like it's the masses.
Very powerful.
But when I talk to people like on day-to-day life, they don't feel like the Twitter of the world, and I tend to fall in the demographic of that younger, being a millennial. So I don't know. I think the perception of capitalism is going to change. And maybe I'm a little bit biased. I come from a country that had a dictatorship less than 60 years ago, so that makes me think a little differently about it also. But I think the perception of it is shifting. It's just an interesting topic. I think many CEOs now are probably thinking about the potential risk of, like, how do we present ourselves? But I don't think it will swing too far in either direction. It's going to probably find its way to the middle somehow.
Yeah, there's an honest interest, I think, in boards at this moment, to find, it doesn't matter what type of business you are, but to find the value add, which is more than just selling an article or selling a service. The value add to the bigger community, and that's maybe also the positive outcome of what we've seen evolving all over the planet. So it's not just being on the bandwagon of we need to be corporate social responsible too, but we do this because it's part of the responsibility we have as a board.
I think you're kind of making my point, right? I don't think it's either or. I don't think it's capitalism has failed, so now we're gonna just go off the rails. I think elements of capitalism have failed, and I think people are recognizing that. Now it's a blending of how do you have socially responsible capitalism.
Yeah,
and those two
synthesis. So we're in the synthesis process.
And those two, they really exist quite well. And when you see them work well, it's like, aha. It's just that most of the people that have been running a lot of these businesses, CSR is a check the box activity, right? It's like, okay, here's a photo op, or here's a feel good thing. But how focused are they really on their people, on their communities, on the various elements of stakeholders? And that is changing. And I think, Jaco, this is where you're right. And Rue, I think you make me smile because you are a very level-headed, very balanced. I mean, you just have a really nice way of processing things. But I think, many people in the younger generations, I think they're maybe a little bit more narrow on some of their thought tracks, and they're forcing change hard. And it's not all going to stick, because I had great ideas when I was 16 too.
That's one thing, and
not all of them stuck. So,
well, the beauty of it all is that the capitalistic society that we live in and we enjoy allows the ability to speak in the way that we do, and allows young people to speak in the way that they do now. And I think from experiences, when you come from a place where you don't have that luxury, you wouldn't even have the voice or the microphone to use it in the way that you do today. And I think sometimes we forget to acknowledge that. And I think, and I say that often because I know many people in my generation don't think about it in such a way. But and like my grandmother tells me stories of, you needed to have a picture of this specific person in your house, and if somebody walked by and that photo wasn't there, you were going to jail just for not having a photo. And we forget that exists in the world today in many different places still.
It does. It does. You know, I think this is, and we can talk about, you know, systemic failures at a societal level, right? Or a socioeconomic level. I mean, failure impacts every element of society all around the world, always has, always will. And, you know, as a world, you know, we can strive to be better. We should strive to be better, and we probably will be better in certain elements. But, you know, we're always going to make mistakes, and we're always going to have failures, and, you know, this too shall pass. I mean, it's just kind of the circle of life, you know, not to wax too eloquent here, but I think, you know, I think what's going on in the world right now is forcing all of us to kind of reframe what we see as materially important or not, what we see as failure that's worthy of kind of, I don't know, coming to the aid and trying to rescue, or failure that's insignificant. And I think whether it's in business, family, politics, you know, failure is a really significant part of what motivates people and what drives people. So, you know, the more healthy and open discussions we can have, like we've had today, I think the better we're all going to be. I don't know that we solved any problems here today. Didn't expect to, but it was a fun conversation, and, you know, hopefully people listening got some value out of it. So, you know, I think we're probably at a good place to wrap it up, and Ru, I'll pass the baton to you, sir.
Oh, yeah, of course. Like always, thanks everybody who stuck around and is watching. And if you got any value of today, please feel free to share it. And once again, please join us next Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.